Portland, Oregon, one of those cozy American cities where people enjoy the tranquility of suburban life and the streets feel cozy and safe. Here lives Michael Garner, a successful businessman, owner of a chain of restaurants, who managed to build an empire from scratch with his energy and persistence. He is 45 years old, and he is an example of a confident and charismatic man. He works hard, but at the same time tries to pay attention to his family. Michael loves his wife and appreciates what they have built together over the years of marriage. Sarah Garner, his wife, a 42-year-old woman with a heightened sense of justice, works for a charity. Outwardly, she seems like an ideal housewife, but her activities are much broader. She helps the homeless, organizes charity events, and always strives to make this world a better place. Her work involves frequent travel, and she often leaves for several days or even weeks to coordinate humanitarian projects in different parts of the country. Their marriage looks strong from the outside, but if you look closely, you can see cracks. Sarah is increasingly immersed in her work, and Michael begins to feel lonely in his own home. But the turning point in their lives came 5 years ago when they decided to adopt a child. They chose a 15-year-old named Eric, a bright and talented boy whose parents had died tragically in a car accident. Eric seemed like the perfect addition to their family from the start. He was humble, polite, and obedient, but also independent, with strong morals and a thirst for higher education. In the first years after his adoption, Eric tried to be the perfect son. He was active in school, played sports, and Michael proudly called him his boy. Sarah, immersed in her work, often did not notice how Michael and Eric were developing a closer relationship. For Michael, this was an opportunity to feel young and needed. He enjoyed every minute spent with his adopted son, whether it was talking about life, going to the gym, or going on trips to nature together. But the more time they spent together, the more Michael began to realize that his feelings for Eric went beyond simple parental ones. He began to feel attracted to the younger man, but he tried to hide it even from himself. He was afraid to realize that he was experiencing something forbidden. At first, he convinced himself that it was simply admiration for Eric's youthful energy and intelligence. But with each passing day, these feelings became more complex and unclear. Michael was confused, trying to maintain control over his emotions, but inside him, a storm was brewing, ready to erupt. Meanwhile, Sarah was becoming increasingly involved in her charity work. She was absent from work, and on the rare occasions when she was home, she seemed distant and tired. She didn't notice how Michael and Eric were getting closer. She thought that her husband was simply becoming a more caring father, and this calmed her down. But behind her, a drama was brewing that could destroy their entire lives. Eric, unknowingly becoming the object of Michael's attraction, at first perceived the care and attention of his adoptive father as something natural. He was grateful to Michael for accepting him into the family, helping him cope with the grief after the loss of his biological parents, supporting him in everything. However, over time, Eric began to notice that Michael's views on him had changed. These were not the usual paternal manifestations of love. The young man did not understand what was happening, and this began to worry him. But he did not dare to talk about it, as he was afraid of destroying the fragile harmony that had been established in their family. So, at first glance, everything looks perfect. A successful husband, a caring wife, and an exemplary son. But behind this facade, there is something darker. A hidden passion begins to emerge in Michael and Eric's relationship, which will eventually lead to the destruction of their lives. In the coming parts, we will see how innocent moments will develop into something dangerous and destructive. This secret romance has only just begun to develop, but it already has devastating consequences for all participants in this story. As Portland continued to live its normal life, a drama was slowly unfolding within the Garner family that no one could have predicted. Michael, who had all the attributes of a successful man, was experiencing internal conflict. He had always prided himself on being an exemplary husband and father, a man who could provide for his family. However, for the past few months, his thoughts had not been focused on the business, or Sarah, or even on his future plans. Eric had been occupying his entire consciousness. These changes began imperceptibly. It all began with the fact that they began to spend more time together. Sarah was busy at work. Her charity projects required frequent travel, and Michael, in order not to be alone, began inviting Eric to men's evenings. They went to the gym, where Michael proudly watched the young man develop physically, turning from a teenager into a man. Their joint sports activities became almost a ritual. After training, they often returned home, discussing everything, from the news and political events to personal experiences. Eric became not only a son to Michael, but also his friend, a person with whom he could talk about everything. But as their communication deepened, Michael began to notice strange changes in himself. At first, it was something subtle. He noticed Eric's physical attractiveness, observed his muscles during training, and then began to catch himself enjoying their touch during wrestling or sports games. Michael realized that he was attracted to Eric, but he didn't know what to do with it. His head was a mess of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, he loved his wife and considered himself a decent person, but on the other, these strange feelings for the younger man were growing stronger. Eric, unaware of Michael's torment, continued to view him as a mentor and father. He felt grateful for the support he received. But with each passing day, he began to notice something strange in his adoptive father's behavior. Michael became more attentive to him. Sometimes his glances seemed too long and intense. Sometimes Eric caught himself thinking that Michael was acting more caring than he should have. This began to bother him, but he did not dare discuss it with anyone. After all, it could just be his imagination. Moreover, Michael was so kind to him that Eric had no reason to doubt his intentions. Michael, on the other hand, was becoming more and more emotional. He began to look for any excuse to spend more time with Eric. It could be evening walks, trips to the store together, watching sports. Every little thing now seemed significant to him. Every moment spent with Eric was filled with a feeling for Michael that he could neither explain nor control. It was not only the physical side that attracted him. He admired the guy's intelligence and emotional maturity, the way he dealt with the difficulties of life. It was more than just an attraction. It became a real obsession. Meanwhile, Sarah was becoming more and more immersed in her projects. She was oblivious to the changing dynamics of their family. She was preoccupied with her work, helping the needy, raising funds, organizing events. She believed she was doing something important, and it brought her inner satisfaction. But she was completely oblivious to the fact that her own family was slowly falling apart. She saw Michael as a reliable partner and father who was doing a great job in her absence. Her mind was elsewhere, and she may not have even wanted to see that something was going wrong. Meanwhile, Michael began to experience serious mental anguish. The internal conflict grew with each passing day. He understood that he had no right to feel such feelings for Eric, that it was wrong, immoral. But the more he tried to resist his feelings, the stronger they became. His own moral foundations were crumbling, and with each passing day, he was losing control of his emotions. One evening, when Sarah was away on business again, Michael and Eric were alone at home. The evening began as usual. They cooked dinner, discussed upcoming plans. But then something changed. There was a tension in the air that was hard to miss. Michael felt it more than ever. After dinner, they sat down to watch a movie, but Michael couldn't concentrate. His mind was occupied with only one thing. How long could he hide his feelings for Eric? He felt like he was about to break down. At some point during the film, something happened between them that became a turning point in their relationship. It could have been a casual gesture, a touch, or just a look, but it became a turning point for Michael. That night, for the first time, Michael realized that he could no longer hide his feelings. He knew it was a step into the abyss, but his passion had already overpowered his reason. Eric, noticing the change in Michael's behavior, felt a strange tension. He didn't understand what was happening, but he felt that there was no longer the same ease between them. Something had changed, and it was beginning to frighten him. But he still didn't realize how deep Michael's feelings for him were. Thus, the relationship between Michael and Eric began to develop into something more dangerous and dark. While Sarah was immersed in her work, a hidden drama was unfolding in the Garner house that would soon come to the surface and destroy everything. After that intense night, when Michael first felt he couldn't hold back his feelings any longer, his relationship with Eric began to undergo serious changes. It all began with Michael consciously seeking privacy with his adopted son. Every time Sarah went away for work or stayed late at the office, he found excuses to be alone with Eric. Sometimes these were trips to the gym, sometimes joint trips to the shops, or even banal evening walks around the neighborhood. But each time, Michael felt his attraction to the young man growing stronger and stronger. Eric, though he sensed that something had changed, still didn't understand the true nature of what was happening. He saw that Michael had become more attentive, sometimes even overprotective, but he chalked it up to his adoptive father simply wanting to maintain a close relationship with him. After all, they had a strong bond, and Eric had always considered Michael his mentor and friend. However, as Michael became more insistent, Eric began to notice odd moments. For example, occasional touches that seemed to last a little longer than the situation called for, or strange looks when they were alone. One evening, when Sarah was away on business for a few days again, Michael suggested to Eric that they have a guys' night. It was an old tradition of theirs. The two of them would cook dinner, watch sports, and just talk about everything. Eric loved these evenings because it gave him the feeling of being part of a family that he had missed so much as a child. But this time, everything was different. From the very beginning of the evening, Michael had been acting strange, almost nervous. He tried to appear relaxed, but something in his demeanor indicated an inner tension. Eric sensed it, but he didn't know how to react to it. As they sat down to watch another game on TV, Michael offered Eric a beer. This wasn't unusual. They sometimes drank together on such evenings. But this time, Michael suggested that they drink a little more than usual. Eric, trying to keep the atmosphere light, agreed, although inside he felt strange. For a few hours they talked, joked, and everything seemed normal. But then Michael suddenly suggested that they talk about more personal things. He started by asking Eric if he felt happy in their family. It was a strange question, but Eric replied that he liked everything and that he was grateful to Michael and Sarah for accepting him as one of their own. However, Michael did not stop there. He began asking more open questions, which embarrassed Eric more and more. He asked about how Eric felt when he saw beautiful bodies, when he played sports, and even about the last time he had a relationship with a girl. Eric began to feel uncomfortable, but being respectful and grateful for all Michael had done for him, he did not want to offend him or interrupt the conversation. He responded, albeit reluctantly, trying to steer the topic in another direction. But Michael continued, revealing more and more of his own feelings. At some point, Eric realized that this conversation was no longer about him, but about Michael. Gradually, the conversation became so intimate that Eric began to realize that his adoptive father felt something more than just parental love for him. This discovery stunned him. He tried to laugh it off, to turn it into a joke, but Michael was too serious. There was something more than just friendly interest in his eyes. Eric felt trapped. As the conversation reached its peak, Michael did something Eric hadn't expected. He touched his hand and didn't pull it away. It wasn't just a friendly touch. It was something much more meaningful. Eric recoiled and a tense silence fell between them. At that moment, Michael realized he had crossed a line he shouldn't have. He tried to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. Eric, dejected and stunned, stood up and went back to his room without saying a word. That night was a turning point in their relationship. Eric, locked in his room, couldn't sleep. His thoughts were spinning around what had just happened. He didn't know how to feel about Michael now. On the one hand, this was the man who had accepted him, given him a new life, supported him all these years. But on the other hand, Michael now seemed like a stranger to him, and this stranger felt something forbidden, something dangerous for him. Eric felt fear, confusion, and shame. He was afraid to even imagine what would happen next. Michael, alone in the living room, sat in the semi-darkness and struggled with his own demons. He knew that he had made a huge mistake, that he would no longer be able to look Eric in the eyes the same way. But deep down, he also knew that he could no longer hide his feelings. His passion for the young man had become too strong, and now he did not know how to live on. He could not go back to his old life, and he was not sure that Eric would ever be able to forgive him for this step. The next day, they both acted as if nothing had happened. Eric avoided conversation, trying to spend as much time as possible outside the house. Michael tried to maintain the appearance of normality, but every time they made eye contact, the tension between them only grew. Eric felt like his world was crumbling. He didn't know who to tell about what had happened, and he was afraid of the consequences if everything was revealed. Michael, on the other hand, was in a state of internal struggle. He wanted to take everything back, but at the same time he couldn't get rid of his feelings. Soon their relationship became like a game of hide and seek. Both pretended that nothing had changed, but each of them knew that it was only an illusion. And the longer they avoided frank conversation, the more tension grew. This moment was the beginning of the end of the harmonious life they had built for so many years, and the beginning of devastating events that would soon change their lives forever. Following that fateful evening when Michael first crossed the line with Eric, an unbearable silence followed. Each new day brought with it more tension. Both Michael and Eric tried to pretend that nothing had changed, but their every move was now accompanied by an internal struggle. Eric began to withdraw more and more, avoiding Michael and trying to spend time outside the home. For the young man, this situation became a source of constant stress and anxiety. Sarah, unaware of the true reasons for her husband and son's strange behavior, attributed everything to normal family difficulties. She had noticed before that Michael had become more nervous, especially in her absence, but she thought it was connected with his business. He often talked about stress at work and new problems with business partners, and Sarah accepted this as an explanation. She was sure that Michael, as usual, would cope with everything as he had before. However, one day, returning home after another business trip, Sarah felt something elusively strange in the atmosphere of their home. Eric was acting too withdrawn, avoiding conversations, and Michael seemed tense and nervous. This seemed strange to Sarah, but she didn't ask any unnecessary questions, deciding that the matter was in some ordinary family problems that she had not noticed while she was traveling. Over time, these changes became too noticeable to ignore. Eric stopped attending family dinners and started coming home later than usual. Sarah tried to talk to him, but he was withdrawn, avoided direct answers, and seemed distant. At 20, Eric seemed much more mature than he had been a few months earlier. This internal crisis was forcing him to grow up quickly, but Sarah saw it as a sign of normal teenage problems. She assumed that Eric was going through a period of adolescence, just like any young person. Michael, on the other hand, was unbearably tense. His internal conflict was tearing him apart. On the one hand, he realized the depth of his mistake and felt guilty for allowing his feelings to get out of control. On the other hand, his passion for Eric was only growing stronger. He felt that he was losing control of the situation, and this did not give him peace. He often could not sleep at night, thinking about how things had gone so far. But most of all, he was tormented by the thought that Eric now saw him differently than before. Sarah, noticing these changes, began to worry. She tried to find the reasons for this behavior of Michael and Eric, but they both avoided her questions. Eric became increasingly distant, and Michael, on the contrary, tried to maintain the appearance of normality, although his internal state was on the edge. This did not escape Sarah's attentive gaze, and she began to suspect that something more serious was happening in their home. One evening, when all three were at home, the tension reached its peak. Sarah decided to have a family dinner, hoping to bring back the atmosphere of the old coziness and calm. She prepared their favorite dishes and tried to create a warm atmosphere at the table. However, everything did not go as she planned. Eric came to dinner, but he was silent and barely touched his food. He tried to avoid Michael's eyes and hardly spoke. Sarah noticed this and decided to find out what was going on. She began asking Eric about his studies, his friends, his plans for the future. Eric answered in monosyllables, not wanting to engage in long conversations. Sarah continued to insist, but his answers became increasingly short and irritated. Michael, seeing the tension growing at the table, tried to change the subject, but this only made the awkwardness worse. At one point, Eric couldn't take it anymore and abruptly stood up from the table saying, "I need to get some air," and then walked out of the house, slamming the door. Sarah was shocked by his behavior. This was not the Eric she knew. She turned to Michael with a question, but he just threw up his hands, trying to explain it all away as teenage problems. After Eric left, a heavy silence fell over the house. Sarah looked at Michael and felt that something was wrong. She couldn't figure out what it was, but her intuition told her that something much more serious was happening in their family than just a teenage crisis. Questions began to appear in her head that she couldn't find answers to. Why was Michael so nervous? Why was Eric avoiding home? What was happening to their family? That night was a turning point for Sarah. She could no longer ignore the obvious signs that something was wrong. A suspicion crept into her heart that Michael was hiding something. Perhaps it was another woman, or something else, stranger and more incomprehensible. She decided that she needed to know the truth, and from that moment on, she began to search for answers to her questions. Thus, the situation in the Garner family became increasingly tense. Sarah felt that her world was collapsing, but she did not yet know how deep the problems were. Eric continued to withdraw into himself, and Michael, although he tried to maintain the appearance of normality, could no longer hide his internal crisis. All this led to the fact that soon Sarah would make the first discovery, which would be the beginning of the end of their family life. After Eric left the family dinner, the tension in the Garner household began to visibly thicken. Michael, alone with his wife, felt trapped. He could no longer ignore his own feelings and realized that a crisis was inexorably approaching. Slowly, Michael began to realize that his seemingly perfect life was crumbling before his eyes. The realization began to burn within him that his attraction to Eric had become too strong to hide from himself and others any longer. Michael had always considered himself a balanced person, a man in control of his life. He had built a successful career, created a family that many could only dream of. On the outside, he was the embodiment of a successful, confident man who knew what he wanted. But the last few months had exposed his inner weaknesses. His attraction to his young adopted son was a real blow to his pride and his morals. Every time Michael saw Eric, his thoughts began to wander in directions he couldn't control. He wanted to believe that this was just a temporary insanity that would pass if he tried to control it. But the more he tried to resist his feelings, the stronger they became. An internal conflict tore him apart. He felt like a prisoner of his own desires, which contradicted everything he believed to be right and moral. Every night when Michael was alone, he fought the incessant thoughts of Eric. He remembered every encounter, every casual touch, every glance. These moments seemed stuck in his head, as if time had stopped. He found himself unable to stop thinking about his adopted son, even when he was at work or socializing with friends. His obsession grew, and he could no longer ignore it. Michael knew that his feelings for Eric were wrong. He knew that if Sarah found out what was going on in his head, their marriage would collapse in an instant. But with each passing day, it was becoming more and more difficult to hide his passion. He realized that sooner or later everything would come out, and then the consequences would be catastrophic. At the same time, he could not stop thinking about the young man. Gradually, Michael began to rationalize his feelings. He tried to convince himself that it was simply a deep emotional attachment to Eric, that they shared a special father-son bond. But even such rationalizations could not drown out his true desires. He found himself looking for excuses to spend more time with Eric, even when he knew that this only made the situation worse. Sarah began to notice changes in Michael more and more. Her suspicions grew, but she didn't yet understand what exactly was going on. Every time she tried to bring up what was bothering her husband, Michael would brush it off, citing work or fatigue. But his nervousness, his sudden outbursts of irritation, and his constant attempts to avoid the conversation made her doubt more and more. Sarah knew that something was wrong with their family, and she was ready to do anything to find out the truth. Michael, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, decided that he needed time to think. He began to avoid contact with Eric, hoping that this would help him cope with what was going on inside him. He spent more time at work, staying late at the office just to avoid being at home. But this did not solve the problem. His thoughts kept returning to Eric, and he realized that running from himself was not going to work. Eric, in turn, became more and more withdrawn. He could no longer ignore Michael's strange behavior. The young man felt that their relationship had reached a turning point, and now he didn't know how to act. On the one hand, Eric still respected Michael as the person who had given him a home and support. But on the other hand, the hints and looks he noticed made him feel uncomfortable. Eric couldn't talk openly with Michael about what was bothering him, but he couldn't pretend that nothing was happening either. One day, when Sarah was busy with her own affairs, Michael decided to return home earlier than usual. He stood for a long time at the door of the house, not daring to go inside. His heart was filled with anxiety and confusion. He knew that he could no longer continue to live in this chaos. He had to make a decision. Either he would finally cross the line and let his feelings take over, or he would try to save what was left of his family. Michael slowly opened the door and walked into the house. Eric was sitting in the living room, lost in thought. Their eyes met, and for a moment there was an oppressive silence between them. At that moment, Michael realized that he could no longer hide his feelings. His realization reached its climax. He was obsessed with Eric, and now there was no denying it. After Eric left the house that tense night, the atmosphere in the Garner household became even more tense. Michael sank deeper into his feelings of guilt and despair, and Eric, feeling betrayed and confused, avoided his adoptive father and tried to spend as little time at home as possible. Their relationship, once strong and warm, now turned into a hidden battle that neither dared to voice. Sarah continued to notice increasingly obvious changes in Eric and Michael's behavior. Her anxiety grew with each passing day. She saw Michael becoming more and more withdrawn and nervous. His habit of coming home late from work, his constant excuses, and his absent-mindedness began to seem suspicious. Eric, on the other hand, began to distance himself from her completely. He spent less and less time at home, avoiding family dinners and conversations. It was incomprehensible to Sarah. Their family, which had always been her pride, was crumbling before her eyes, and she did not know why. With each passing day, she became more and more convinced that something was going on that she didn't know about. Her suspicions grew. She began to look for an explanation in Michael's possible betrayal. Maybe he had another woman? These thoughts troubled her nights. But soon, Sarah began to notice something even stranger. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in her mind. Michael was looking for Eric too often, asking him too many questions, offering to help even when it was inappropriate. Their relationship seemed strange, and this only increased her anxiety. One evening, when Eric was out of the house again, Sarah decided to talk to Michael. She needed to know the truth, even though she was afraid of what she might hear. As they sat together in the kitchen, the atmosphere was tense. Sarah couldn't stand it any longer and asked Michael directly, "What's going on with you and Eric? Why have you both become so distant? Are you hiding something from me?" Michael, stung by her direct question, didn't know what to say. He knew that if he told the truth, he would lose everything: his wife, his family, his respect. His fear of his secret being revealed was so great that he couldn't confess. Instead, he tried to deflect the question by saying that he was simply having a lot of trouble at work and that Eric was going through a difficult period of growing up. But Sarah was no longer satisfied with such answers. She saw that Michael was lying. Her intuition told her that there was something much deeper and more dangerous hidden behind it. Inwardly, she was already preparing herself for the fact that she would learn something shocking. She decided to find out the truth by any means necessary. Meanwhile, Eric, feeling that the situation was getting worse, decided to take a decisive step. He could no longer live under the same roof with Michael. His sense of fear and disgust at what was happening grew with each passing day. Eric began to seriously think about leaving home and starting a life on his own. He was full of contradictions. On the one hand, he did not want to let down Sarah, who had always been like a mother to him. But on the other hand, his relationship with Michael had become unbearable. Eric decided to discuss his thoughts with a friend he trusted. This conversation was very difficult for him because he could not tell the whole truth without ruining his reputation and without giving away too much. However, his friend realized that the situation was serious and offered Eric to stay with him temporarily. Eric, although hesitant, decided that this could be a temporary solution until he figured out how to deal with the situation. That night, when Eric was about to leave home, his plans changed dramatically. Sarah accidentally found correspondence on Michael's computer that completely destroyed her illusions. She came across personal messages that Michael had sent to Eric. In these messages, there were subtle hints that spoke of a much deeper connection between them than she could have imagined. At first, Sarah could not believe her eyes. She reread the lines over and over, hoping that this was some kind of terrible dream, but the truth was right in front of her. She felt the world around her begin to crumble. It was worse than any betrayal. Sarah realized that her husband had something terrible and forbidden for their adopted son. Her heart sank with pain and disgust. In an instant, her entire idea of family life, of Michael and Eric, was shattered. Unable to cope with the overwhelming emotions, Sarah hurried out of the house. She didn't know what to do next. She needed time to process what she had seen. Tears rolled down her cheeks and she felt like her world was falling apart. Sarah knew she was about to have a serious conversation with Michael and possibly Eric, but she wasn't prepared for what she might hear in response. Thus, the situation in the family reached a critical point. Michael's secret was no longer a secret for Sarah, and she understood that now everything would change. She did not yet know what to do, but one thing was clear: their life would never be the same. Sarah returned home late that night, overwhelmed with emotion and anxiety. She could not find peace after what she had discovered. Thoughts swirled in her head: betrayal, pain, disgust, anger. All these emotions merged into one painful cocktail that did not allow her to breathe. She knew that she could no longer put off the inevitable. Sarah had to demand an explanation. She needed to know the truth. Michael sat in the living room, lost in his thoughts. He didn't know that Sarah had discovered his correspondence with Eric, and he had no idea that his secret was about to come out. When Sarah entered the room, Her face was stony, but her eyes betrayed the storm that was raging inside her. She quietly closed the door, stood in front of Michael, and said, "We need to talk." Michael felt a chill run through his body. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how serious it was yet. He nodded silently, inviting Sarah to sit across from him. Her voice was quiet, but there was a hidden strength in it. "I saw your correspondence with Eric." The words struck like lightning. Michael instantly turned pale. Fear and panic flashed in his eyes. He tried to speak, but the words were stuck in his throat. His mind desperately tried to find a way out of this situation, but all options seemed impossible. What do you mean?" he asked, trying to sound as calm as possible, although there was already a tremor in his voice. "I saw everything, Michael. I saw you writing to him. I saw you touching him. I saw you looking at him." Sarah spoke slowly, each word a dagger piercing deeper and deeper into his heart. Michael couldn't deny it any longer. He knew the truth was out. His secret, the one he had kept so carefully, had destroyed everything. He looked at Sarah and saw a mixture of anger, disappointment, and pain in her eyes. She was the woman he loved, but now he was a stranger to her, a traitor. "Sarah, he began, but his voice betrayed him. He didn't know what to say. How could he explain what he had done? How could he justify his weakness and betrayal? "How could you?" Her voice shook. "How could you do this to me, to our family, to Eric?" She stood up from her chair, unable to sit still any longer. Her emotions were spilling out. She paced the room, unsure how to cope with this pain. She loved Michael. She trusted him. She believed that they were building a strong family. But now everything she believed in was a lie. "It's not what you think." Michael tried to justify himself, but his voice sounded weak and unconvincing. He knew it was a futile attempt. He had lost control of the situation, and now all he could do was wait for everything to collapse. "Not what I think," Sarah asked, anger in her voice. "I saw it with my own eyes. You betrayed me. You betrayed Eric. You destroyed our family." Michael was silent. He had no words. He knew he could no longer hide the truth, that his life, his family, all of it was ruined. His passion for Eric, his obsession that he had tried to hide for so long, was now out in the open, and there was no turning back. "I don't know who you are, Michael," Sarah continued, her voice turning cold. "The man I spent so many years with, the man I loved, the man I considered my husband. You betrayed everything that was important to us. How could you do this to Eric? He's our son." "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Michael said quietly, not looking up at Sarah. "I don't know how it happened. It was stronger than me." "Stronger than you?" There was more anger in her voice than he expected. "You let your desires destroy our family. You don't even realize what you've done." Sarah knew her life would never be the same again. She had lost everything: the husband she believed in, the family they had built, the trust that had held their relationship together. There was no going back. Michael tried to approach her, but she recoiled. "Don't you dare touch me," she said coldly, not looking at him. "I can't even look at you." Sarah, unable to bear it any longer, ran out of the room, leaving Michael alone with his ruined life. He realized that he had lost everything, and his guilt became unbearable. Now, his secret was out, and the consequences would be catastrophic. When Eric finally gathered his things and walked out of the house, the silence that fell in the empty Garner house was deafening. Michael, sitting in the kitchen, stared at the door his adopted son had just walked through, knowing that this departure was the end of everything. His hands were shaking, his heart was pounding, and his mind was racing with thoughts of how things had gotten this far. He knew that this moment would be the point of no return. Sarah, alone with Michael, couldn't ignore the reality any longer. Her heart was broken, and the betrayal was burning inside her. She watched their family, which seemed strong and unshakable, crumble before her eyes. Eric's words still echoed in her mind when he said he couldn't stay in this house any longer, and although Sarah understood perfectly well that he had to leave, it didn't ease her pain. Hours had passed since Eric had left, but Michael still hadn't gotten his thoughts together. He felt as if his world had fallen apart. He had lost control of the situation, and now there was no turning back. Michael was lost in his own torment, realizing that his passion, which he had hidden for so long, had destroyed everything he held dear. Finally, Sarah couldn't stand the silence any longer and walked up to Michael. Her face was calm, but her eyes were filled with cold determination. "We need to talk," she said, trying to contain her emotions. Michael looked at her but couldn't speak. He felt that any words would be useless now. He knew that he couldn't justify himself or try to explain his actions any longer. "Do you understand what you've done?" Sarah continued, her voice firm but trembling with suppressed anger. "You destroyed our family. You betrayed me. You betrayed Eric. How could you?" Michael wanted to say something, but his voice betrayed him. He knew that words could not bring back what was lost. All he could offer at that moment was silence. His suffering was obvious, but Sarah could no longer sympathize with him. She could no longer see him as the man she had once built a life with. "I can't live with you anymore," she said quietly but firmly. "This is the end." The words hit Michael in the face. Even though he had expected this to happen, hearing it from Sarah was unbearable. Everything inside him collapsed. He no longer knew how to live. Sarah stood up and began to pace the room. She couldn't calm down. Her thoughts were chaotic, but one thing was clear. This marriage no longer made sense. Her heart was broken, but she knew she had to move on. "I'm going to file for divorce," she added coldly. "I can't live in this house. I can't be around you. I can't trust you anymore." Michael nodded silently, knowing that there was no point in resisting. He had already lost everything: his family, his wife's trust, and most importantly, his moral foundation. His passion for Eric had destroyed everything he considered important, and now all he could do was admit his failure. Sarah, gathering her last strength, walked to the door. She couldn't stay in this house filled with pain and betrayal any longer. She knew she needed time to process what had happened and maybe find a way to recover from all of this. But one thing was clear: her life would never be the same again. "I'm going to my mother," she said, not looking at Michael. "I need time to figure out how to live my life. You can stay here, but I won't come back." Michael was silent, unable to look up at her. He knew that her decision was final and that this moment marked the end of their marriage. Sarah no longer wanted to see him, to hear his explanations or attempts to justify himself. When she closed the door behind her, Michael was left alone in the empty house. The room was dark and the silence was unbearable. His mind sank deeper into despair. He realized that he had lost everything because of his weakness and inability to control his feelings. Long hours passed, but Michael could not find peace. He remembered those moments when his family was happy, when he felt like a loving husband and father. But now, all this was destroyed. He could no longer return to those days when life seemed simple and understandable. That night became a nightmare for Michael, one he couldn't wake up from. His family was destroyed, and he was the one who caused it. Now that Sarah was gone and Eric wasn't coming back, Michael was alone with his demons. His life, once full of confidence and stability, was now filled only with pain and regret. After Sarah and Eric left, the Garner household fell into a complete silence that weighed on Michael more and more each day. The emptiness left by the destruction of his family filled every room, every thought. Michael was in a state of near collapse. He could no longer concentrate on his work, and his friends and colleagues noticed that something was wrong with him. He rarely left the house, avoided meetings and business negotiations. His life, which had once seemed so under control, turned into an endless series of painful memories and remorse. Every night, Michael was alone with his thoughts, and it became torture. He replayed the events of the last few months over and over in his head, asking himself how things had gotten this far. His feelings for Eric, which had once seemed like a forbidden but harmless attraction, had now completely destroyed his life. He knew he had caused the destruction of his family, but what tormented him most was the thought that he had betrayed those who trusted him. Michael was becoming more and more withdrawn. The depression he had previously tried to suppress was beginning to overwhelm him. Each new day seemed endlessly long and meaningless. His thoughts were increasingly going to dark places, where he was trying to understand what had led him to such a fall. He began to wonder, was it even worth continuing to live in this state? Michael's inner crisis grew, and with it a growing sense of utter powerlessness. He could no longer control his emotions, which overwhelmed him like a storm. Everything he had once considered important now seemed distant and unattainable. Family, work, respect, all of it had collapsed, leaving only a feeling of utter hopelessness. As the weeks passed, Michael became more and more withdrawn. He stopped caring about himself, his home, his life in general. Each day was like the last, empty, silent, alone. He began to feel like his life had no meaning. He felt like a man who had lost everything that was important to him and was now forced to live in his own prison, created by his mistakes. One day, unable to bear the tension, Michael decided to call Sarah. He stared at the phone for a long time, hesitating to dial her number, but finally he pressed the call button. There was still a glimmer of hope in his heart that maybe they could at least talk, discuss what had happened, find some way out of this nightmare. But Sarah did not answer. Her silence was the final answer. She no longer wanted to have anything to do with him. This rejection finally broke Michael. He realized that he had lost her forever, and that there was no longer any hope of getting back even a part of his old life. He was alone, abandoned by everyone he had once loved, and now he had to live with this realization for the rest of his days. Eric, as it turned out later, moved to another city to start a new life away from everything that reminded him of Michael. He, too, was devastated by what had happened, but he tried to move on. He found temporary housing with friends and planned to continue his studies, but the pain of betrayal still burned inside him. Eric tried to hide his emotions, but every time he thought about his family, he felt unbearably heavy. Michael, left alone, began to think more and more about the meaning of his life. He no longer saw a future, no way to restore what had been destroyed. His mental state became worse and worse, and he began to withdraw even deeper into himself. He stopped going out, stopped communicating with friends who tried to help him. It seemed that Michael had voluntarily imprisoned himself in his own guilt. Every night when Michael was alone, his thoughts became darker. He began to wonder if he should continue to live if life had become so unbearable. His inner world was destroyed, and he no longer saw the meaning of his existence. Michael's psychological decline reached its peak when he got out of bed one morning and felt a complete emptiness inside. He no longer felt any pain or regret, only a cold, devastating indifference to everything. That day, he made a decision that would change the course of his life. Michael was thus on the verge of collapse, both physically and psychologically. His life had become an endless series of sufferings, and he no longer knew how to get out of this nightmare. The internal crisis that began with his forbidden feelings for Eric had now completely destroyed his existence, leaving him alone and without hope for the future. After weeks of complete loneliness and deep depression, Michael, on the brink of total psychological collapse, began to change his thoughts. Gradually, his feelings of guilt and self-blame turned into something darker: anger. At first, this anger was directed at himself, at how he had ruined his own life, but then this anger began to focus on others. First of all, on Eric. Michael began to convince himself that Eric had played a role in the destruction of their family. In his sick, twisted mind, Eric was no longer an innocent victim. Michael began to think that the younger man had deliberately provoked him, knowing where it would lead. His anger grew with each passing day, like a volcano ready to erupt. It was easier for him to blame others for his troubles than to admit his own mistakes. Michael couldn't forgive Eric for leaving home, for ruining his life and taking Sarah away. He believed that if Eric had stayed, if they had been able to talk things out and sort things out, things might have turned out differently. But Eric left, and with that decision, everything Michael had tried to hold on to crumbled. He now saw Eric not as the adopted son he had once loved, but as a traitor. These thoughts, filled with anger and rage, began to fill Michael's mind completely. He could no longer think of anything else. Every night he replayed the scenes of their breakup in his head, but each time he blamed Eric more and more. Gradually, a dark idea began to form in his head: revenge. He began to think that justice could only be restored in one way. Eric must pay for ruining his life. Michael began to formulate a plan. He needed to find Eric to end this once and for all. He wanted to see Eric feel the same pain he had felt. This plan slowly began to turn into an obsession. Michael no longer saw any meaning in his life, but the thought of getting revenge became the only light in his dark world. He began looking for information about where Eric was currently living. Michael knew that his adopted son had moved to another city to start a new life. He learned that Eric was still in college, living with friends, trying to forget the past and recover from the traumatic events. This only added fuel to the fire. Michael couldn't stand the thought of Eric simply continuing to live as if nothing had happened while his own life was in tatters. Michael began to prepare for his trip. He thought through every step, imagining what it would be like to meet Eric. His thoughts became even darker. He didn't know what he would do when he found Eric, but a picture formed in his mind where he would put an end to this story. This was not just revenge, it was an act of restoring justice in his eyes. One evening, as Michael sat in the darkness of his deserted living room, he picked up the phone and dialed the number of one of his old friends with whom he had once shared a business. He knew that this man could help him get the information he needed. The conversation was short but fruitful. Michael learned that Eric actually lived in one of the neighboring towns and was on his college campus quite often. This was the information he was looking for. After this conversation, Michael felt a strange calm. For the first time in a long time, he felt in control of his life. He had a goal, and he knew what he had to do. His mind was no longer plagued by doubts or guilt. Everything was now crystal clear. He would go to Eric to finish what had been started. Over the next few days, Michael began planning his trip. He bought a bus ticket and packed the necessary things. His obsession grew with each passing day. He no longer saw this as madness. His plan seemed logical and right. Michael was sure that he had to see it through to the end to restore his sense of justice. Before the trip, Michael decided to write a letter to Sarah. It was a short, cold message in which he apologized for everything that had happened, but at the same time blamed her for leaving him alone in a difficult moment. In this letter, Michael again returned to his inner certainty that Eric was the cause of all their troubles. He wrote that he would fix everything and that she would not suffer anymore. When the letter was sent, Michael felt relieved. Now he had no more obstacles. He was ready to act. The day of the trip arrived. Michael got up early in the morning, packed his things, and headed to the bus station. He knew that ahead of him was a meeting that would change everything. There were no more regrets in his head, only a firm conviction that revenge was the only way to regain control of his life. The bus was taking him out of town, leaving behind a broken home, a broken relationship, and his old life. Michael looked out the window, his thoughts focused on Eric, on what was ahead. After the conflict at college, things quickly spiraled out of control. Michael, mad with anger and despair, was detained by security, but this did not stop his obsession with revenge. His thoughts were increasingly filled with darkness, and he could not afford to retreat. That night, after he was released, Michael returned to the motel where he was staying, but he could not sleep. His mind kept returning to the meeting with Eric, to how he said that Michael had ruined his own life. These words tormented him and increased his hatred. Michael felt that the final point was not yet made. Around midnight, sitting in the dark, Michael made his final decision. He could no longer live unless he took revenge. He was ready for anything. The feeling of helplessness that had overwhelmed him after meeting Eric had turned into complete madness. He no longer saw Eric as the young man he had once loved like a son. Now he saw only a traitor, a man who must pay for everything. Michael grabbed the knife he'd grabbed from the motel kitchen and headed back to the house where he knew Eric lived. His steps were fast. His thoughts were hazy. His anger had consumed him, leaving him with only one desire: to end this once and for all. Meanwhile, Eric was in his apartment trying to recover from the incident of the day. His friends were trying to support him, but there was concern in their eyes too. They knew that Michael hadn't just lost his temper. He was a real threat. Eric thought he should call the police, but he still hesitated. He couldn't believe that Michael would go to such extremes. This was the man who had once been his adoptive father, the man he trusted. But after today's confrontation, Eric was beginning to realize that Michael had long since crossed the line of reason. That night, Eric couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, replaying all the recent events in his head. The fear was gradually growing, and his friends offered to stay with him just in case. No one could predict what would happen next. When Michael reached the house where Eric lived, he paused for a few minutes at the entrance, as if gathering his last strength. There was no logic or plans in his head. He was consumed by only one goal. The house was quiet, and Michael knew it was time to act. He crept up to the window through which he saw the light in one of the rooms and began to look for a way to get inside. Meanwhile, Eric, feeling that something was wrong, suddenly heard a rustling sound at the window. His heart sank. He slowly walked to the window, looked through the curtains, and saw a dark figure that he immediately recognized. It was Michael. Eric immediately realized that the situation had become dangerous and screamed, calling for help from his friends. But it was too late. Michael, seeing that he had been noticed, rushed to the door. Eric ran to the exit, trying to close it, but Michael, in a rage, kicked the door down, rushing at him with a knife in his hand. At that very moment, a scream was heard, and Eric's friends tried to intervene, but Michael was too strong and mad with anger. They grappled, and Michael pushed Eric to the floor with force, holding the knife in his hand. There was darkness in his eyes, his face distorted with rage. Eric, choking with fear, screamed for him to stop, but Michael no longer heard his words or the screams of his friends. "You ruined everything," Michael hissed, leaning closer to Eric. "You have to pay for this." As Michael swung the knife, one of Eric's friends grabbed his arm forcefully, trying to stop him. But Michael broke free, and a struggle began. In the chaos, amidst screams and attempts to hold Michael back, the knife finally found its mark. Eric cried out in pain as the knife sank deep into his side. Blood splattered on the floor, and everything around him seemed to stop. Eric fell with a scream, clutching at his wound. His friends, mad with shock, tried to hold Michael back, but their efforts were too late. Michael froze for a moment when he saw the blood. He looked at Eric, who was lying on the floor, bleeding, and suddenly his rage subsided, giving way to horror and realization. He stood over him, looking at his bloody hands, as if he had just realized what he had done. Everything he had done to get revenge had now turned into a madness that he could not control. The police and ambulance sirens were already blaring in the distance, but for Michael, the moment felt like an eternity. He looked at Eric's dying body and realized that his actions had led to complete disaster. Everything he had once wanted to fix had only gotten worse. There was no turning back now. When the police stormed the house, Michael was subdued and disarmed, but he did not resist. He was in a state of shock, as if he realized that his revenge had turned into an absolute failure. Eric, bleeding, was taken to the hospital, but his condition was critical. That night, Michael finally realized that he had lost not only his family, but himself. Michael, arrested that night, found himself in a state of profound shock at the police station. It was hard for him to comprehend what had happened. He sat in his cell, lost in his own thoughts, unable to process the horror of what he had done. Everything he had ever wanted to protect had been destroyed before his eyes. And worst of all, it was his own hand that had destroyed the life of the young man he had once considered a son. Eric was rushed to hospital in critical condition. Doctors fought to save his life for many hours, but the wound was too deep. The blood loss was catastrophic, and despite all the efforts of the doctors, Eric died on the operating table in the early morning hours. This moment became the point of final destruction for everyone involved in this tragedy. When Sarah learned what had happened, she felt shock and pain that could not be described in words. Her son, whom she loved and fought for, was killed by her husband, the man with whom she had lived most of her life. Her world had completely collapsed. Sarah could not understand how all this had happened, how Michael had gotten to this point. For her, it was more than just a betrayal. It was the destruction of everything she believed in. The atmosphere at Eric's funeral was oppressive. His friends, classmates, and people who knew him as a kind and intelligent young man gathered to say goodbye. Everyone was shocked that such a bright life could end in such a terrible way. Sarah was devastated, her face contorted with grief. She was restless, knowing that this nightmare would never end. Michael was soon brought to trial for murder. His lawyers tried to rely on his unstable mental state as a defense, but even that could not excuse the brutality and premeditation of his actions. He could not deny that he had deliberately gone to Eric with the intention of revenge, and that his actions had led to the young man's death. In court, Michael looked broken and depressed. He barely spoke. His eyes were empty. He was no longer the confident man who once built a successful business and had a strong family. His face became a mirror of despair and destruction. All his attempts to blame Eric for what happened were futile. In the end, he realized that he was the only one to blame for this tragedy. At the trial, Sarah testified against Michael. It was one of the hardest experiences of her life. She spoke quietly but firmly, telling what had happened, how her family had been destroyed, how her husband, whom she had once loved, had become the murderer of her adopted son. Her eyes were full of pain, but also determination to get justice for Eric. The jury found Michael guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison without parole. The verdict was the logical conclusion to the destructive path he had set himself on. Michael did not protest when he heard the verdict. He knew he deserved everything he got and saw no point in fighting any further. He was now a prisoner not only of his cell, but also of his own demons that had led him to disaster. In prison, Michael sank deeper into depression. He no longer had a family, a job, or friends. Everyone had turned their backs on him, and he was left alone with a shattered conscience. His life became an endless string of monotonous days, where the only companion was the feeling of guilt for what he had done. He knew that he would never see freedom again, and that his life had ended the moment he decided to commit murder. Sarah, despite her enormous emotional blow, found the strength to continue living. She began to participate in charitable projects related to supporting families who had experienced violence and dedicated her activities to Eric's memory. Although the pain of loss never left her, she tried to make something meaningful out of this tragedy so that others could avoid such a fate. The story was a terrible reminder of how destructive secret desires, repressed emotions, and unprocessed pain can be. Michael's revenge destroyed him and everyone around him. The ending of this tragedy was a lesson in how obsession and anger can only lead to destruction if allowed to spiral beyond reason. Michael remained living in his prison cell, surrounded by silence and memories of what was once his life.